Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad on Capitalism Hits Home, an interpersonal update. This is a show about the intersection of capitalism, class, and our personal lives. This is a continuation, and I hope you hear both the first and the second parts of this discussion of the uses and abuses of sex. Shame is something that is instilled around sexuality. In boys, it's shame at emotional neediness and often shame at sexuality as well. In girls, it's shame at wanting to be sexual and often being shamed if they are sexual, being called sluts, whores, so on. In fact, men who rape women often insult them with those epithets at the same time. Shame creates violence in sex because people are angry at needing sex. In Bachoven's big book about sexuality, he points out that there were no rapes in the island of Tahiti until the missionaries got there, because there was no shame before that. An illustration of the power of shame and the anger that people feel that men feel, particularly when they're ashamed and cover it with rage, is at the average life expectancy of a prostitute in the United States is 34 years old. And that's because men are so angry at their need for sex that they kill the object of their need, which is quite severe. Those attitudes are also shaped in our culture, and in every other culture, by our sex education program, which in the United States is terrible. 86% of schools in the United States do not have an explicit, careful sex education program, so that most kids learn sex education from watching porn, which is easy to access on computers and on televisions. So they learn that sex involves a disregard of the other person and often gross humiliation of a woman who seems willing to be humiliated if it's heterosexual sex. In homosexual sex and homosexual porn, it's just men saying hello to each other and wanting immediately to start having sex, but having at least a mutual good time, so it's not quite as damaging. Those attitudes really shape us, which is why America wildly leads in violent crime and rape. The first 5 countries on the happiness scale that is drawn by the UN, the 2019 scale just came out, the 5 happiest people in the world are people in Finland, Iceland, Norway, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Those are 1 to 5. United States is 19th, right there with Romania. Whoa, poor country. And that's because, in part, those are sex-positive cultures. I was surprised when I went to Sweden to see in the bathroom these posters of happy penises with big smiles on their faces, putting on condoms with sayings to the side of the big happy penis. Remember me when you go out and have fun. Remember me when you're going on a date. Really quite surprising. That kind of sex-positive message. And in American schools, kids don't learn about sex in relationship. They just learn a biological thing, if anything, at all. That's one of the reasons we have the highest teen pregnancy rate in the developed world. Kids don't know. And in Christian schools, there's a higher teen pregnancy rate because they're even more sure not to know what's going on. Sex education in Sweden is a very sex-positive thing. It starts in kindergarten, and this is shared by the other countries I mentioned. Starts in kindergarten with a discussion of how the bee has to take the pollen from one flower, a female flower, or a male flower to a female flower, so that flower can make seeds, and that flower makes seeds, and other flowers grow. And they go on discussing animals and things that are not directly sexual in a human way until middle school, when they start teaching the kids about male and female bodies and how they change and why they change in case there should be children made in the future. In high school, they start talking about relationships. What are the possibilities of joy and responsibilities towards your partner in a sexual relationship, and also your offspring if a child should result from that relationship. I remember being in France and being surprised to see that every few blocks there's a condom machine right on the street, because it's acknowledged that people have sex and should have condoms, and that they had the nurse able to give morning after pills to the girls who might have gotten pregnant and been unprotected the night before. Those are very different attitudes from the attitudes in the United States, which are inflected by the Puritanism of evangelical religions. That's one of the reasons that rape rates are about 1/10 in those countries as they are in the United States, because people don't have shame, anger, and violence about sexual needs. Now, what can we do about this? What can we do to create a positive use of sexuality as a way of intensifying relationships, as a way of experiencing one's body with pride, as a way of being careful of one's body so that one doesn't get sexually transmitted diseases, while having pleasure that's mutual? What can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is not let religious extremists shape the agenda of our public schools. Another thing that we can do, which may seem far-fetched, but it actually isn't, is we could have fully paid quality childcare, starting at birth and going on from there, and after-school care. Now, how does that relate to sex? Well, it does, because the people who stay home and are in charge of children's lives are usually women, because if they're with a man, he makes so much more money that it makes more sense for the lower earner to be the one who's home. 82% is what women get of what men get for the same job. 82% of the male dollar. That's really of all women. Black women make less, 69% of the male dollar. Mothers make 61% of the male dollar, because it becomes harder and harder to be in a job that doesn't respect one's role as a mother. If you're in one of the more enlightened countries of the world, which most developed wealthy countries are, you either get a 5-year maternity or paternity leave, you get parental leaves, you get family leaves, you get all sorts of leaves that allow you to leave your job for a while and go back at the same salary and be paid 80% of your salary, up to $540,000 a month, until you go back to work, which means the children aren't needing to be brought up in a matriarchy. They're in a much more egalitarian society. And if they're single mothers, they're in child care centers with male and female caretakers. And single mothers make 98% of what men earn in those societies, because they have subsidized housing, they have subsidized child care, they have clothing allowances for their children, and they have child allowances for whatever their children need. and so that they don't have to worry and stay home or be desperately poor. 2/3 of prostitutes are single mothers. That's a stat that is a very recent stat, as well as it's a stat that came from a long time ago, too. But it was done in England, where there are a lot more studies of prostitution and mothering in prostitution than there are here. 2/3 were single mothers who had to be able to have a part-time job and still make enough money for them and their children to survive. That's a terrible comment on the United States. And that could be changed with the kind of policies that the other advanced nations have, whether they're the top 5 that I mentioned, or France and Germany and Switzerland, really. So that's wage equality and maternity and paternity subsidy would be a big antidote to the kind of abuses of sex and gender separation from which we suffer. When I went to Sweden, I was really impressed to see what I would probably see if I went to Iceland or Finland or the Netherlands also. All sorts of fathers on the street with their strollers and their little kids, playing and looking really happy. As many fathers as mothers I saw on the street playing with their children and seeming to enjoy them enormously. That would be such a help to mothers and children in the United States. We'd also have to change our culture to value gender equality. In Sweden, they don't use gender pronouns in the younger grades, starting in pre-kindergarten, because they don't want children to see themselves as bifurcated into 2 genders, which makes a lot of sense. And they deliberately encourage the kids to play with the whole range of toys, not just sexually stereotyped toys. They also don't have their kids play with guns. I walked around playgrounds in Sweden as well as in France. The kids are not playing with guns, males or females. We'd have to change sex education to discuss mutual pleasure, mutual exploration of each other, and mutual respect for one another. Those are all big changes. We could have a collective economy of co-ops where men and women were equal and they all had the kind of benefits that they have in the 5 happiest countries in the world. We're still the richest country in the world, but we don't have those benefits. And we have a president who is a proud pussy grabber. And we have people like Weinstein who've been raping women for 30 years and getting away with it. Or Epstein, who raped hundreds of girls with the collusion of our intelligence agencies so they could get photographic images of rich men and world leaders raping girls and use them as blackmail. And of course, it is interesting, as I've talked about before, that all that footage disappeared after Epstein's safe in his mansion was blown open and the tapes were revealed. There's a lot of tolerance for sexual exploitation. And I think you'd have to make the changes that I mentioned in order to have men and women enjoy sex as equals, enjoying pleasure together, as volunteers and as equals. And so the uses and abuses of sex have to do certainly as much with the culture as with anybody's biological sexuality. Since sexuality can disappear with cultural prohibitions. Incest survivors usually don't have sexual drives. They may want sex for attention because that was a way they got attention, but a sex drive is usually gone because the culture has associated that with predation for them. So when we talk about the uses and abuses of sex, we're talking about a social construction of gender. We're talking about messages of shame given by religion. We're talking about body images. We're talking about a culture that humiliates boys for needing soothing and kindness so that the men who can afford it get high-end prostitutes to understand them, or sugar babies, or just buy a GFE. The most popular GFE, girlfriend experience, is the most popular of all the sex options for American men, where somebody is with them for the required hired amount of time, where they listen, where they remember, where they're kind of like a therapist, where they soothe. I have a client who did that and who went to conferences and things with men, some of whom didn't want sex. They just wanted her company, someone to have dinner with, someone to act like she liked him, somebody to listen, somebody to praise, somebody to soothe. And that's sad that that has to go under the title of sex. So in our culture, sex is used and often abused for reasons that don't have to do with sex itself. They have to do with our economy. They have to do with gender. They have to do with religion. They have to do with education. And we can change those for a more sex-positive culture. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. Please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info.